Well, welcome everybody to Aligning Your Course. It's a UW Core Elements conversation. My name is Penelope Moon, and it's my great pleasure to direct the Center for Teaching and Learning here on the Seattle campus of the University of Washington. I'm also affiliate associate professor in history and a proud member of the Teaching at UW network, which is a tri-campus organization that seeks to coordinate and refine instructional resources for folks on all three of UW's campuses. Today's session is part of a series of events we're hosting this year to help broaden and deepen understanding of the new core elements of effective teaching, which the UW faculty voted to adopt into the faculty code last spring. Many of you are already aware of and already practice these elements, but I wanted to take a few moments to introduce and review them before we get to our wonderful faculty panelists. I'm going to share my screen and one of our crew will put in chat a link to a website that I'm going to show you. This is on the Teaching at UW website, and it outlines the core elements that were adopted into the faculty code last spring. It does have a link to the actual faculty code, but anybody who's been in the faculty code knows that the formatting makes it a little hard to read. So we've done the work for you and pulled out the core elements, and you can see them on this webpage. These elements are backed by decades of research and, like I said, already practiced by scores of UW faculty members. They're not a comprehensive list of all effective teaching practices, but they are core to any effective teaching practice, regardless of your discipline, your teaching context, whether you teach big courses or small seminars, and regardless of your campus. The elements emerged from a more than 2-year-long effort by members of the Faculty Senate Councils and the Future of Teaching and Learning Initiative, and they emerged from deep consultation with hundreds of faculty and academic professionals across UW and also at peer institutions across the United States. So, like I said, over the course of the academic year, Teaching at UW is going to host 5 sessions, each focused on one of these new core elements. And today's session is going to focus on the first element, which is about alignment. And as you can see on the Teaching at UW core element page, that element reads, aligned, effective teaching is intentionally designed and organized to help learners meet learning objectives. And I can actually go ahead and put that in chat as well. So let me do that really quick, if I can find my chat. So you'll have that in chat. That's kind of going to be the focus of what we talk about today. So why alignment? Well, research shows that when teaching is organized around clearly articulated, measurable learning objectives, students' academic performance and their attitudes improve. And interestingly, faculty satisfaction also improves. So it's a win-win. Everybody wins when a course is aligned. I will also note that at the end of the session, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. At the end of the session, I'll be sharing another webpage with lots of information about how to begin the process of integrating alignment into your teaching practice. We're going to talk a lot about that today. Our faculty panelists are going to share their experience doing that work. We also have a webpage that you can consult 24/7 when you begin this work. Well, let's get to the conversation. It's my real pleasure to introduce our faculty panelists today. Kristen Gustafson is teaching professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at UW's Bothell campus. And Joel Ross is teaching professor in the Information School at UW's Seattle campus. And I've worked with both of them really closely, and they're awesome people, and I'm really excited to share space with them today. Oh, lots of thumbs up and clapping. You guys have pretty good reps, it looks like. Awesome. The structure of today's session, we're going to start with a faculty panel. I'm going to ask them some questions. We're going to chat a bit, and then we'll have a Q&A session. We'll take your questions, but we ask that you put them in the Q&A space in this webinar, not in chat. We won't be addressing questions in chat. So you can feel free to put questions in the Q&A area, which you can access by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see that icon, click on the More icon. That More icon is just a treasure trove, and that'll open up a drop-down menu, and you can click into the Q&A space. You can post your question anytime there, even as we're talking. If you see a colleague post a question that you're interested in also learning the answer to, you can upvote it. And we're actually going to be starting with the most upvoted, not that it's a contest, but we'll start with the most upvoted questions. And so, because we do want to get to the questions that most people are interested in. So you can put your questions in the Q&A spot anytime you want. Okay, all right. Kristen, Joel, you ready? Okay. The first question I'm going to ask our panelists to just chat about is, can you talk about how you develop aligned courses? And I think, Joel, we'll start with you.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So the way that I think about making aligned courses is really following a principle of backwards design, which is how I learned to develop courses when I was a PhD student. I was studying to be an instructor. So backwards design is really the process of when you're thinking of your courses, of starting from what is the objectives, what are the outcomes, and then what are the assessments you use to measure that, and then what are the activities students will use to be able to actually learn that stuff in order to meet those assessments. This is how I just learned to develop classes, to think what do you want to get? What's the point? What's the goal? What is the outcome you're trying to achieve? Being able to sort of define that and then figure out how will I know if students have gotten there? What assessments, what exams, what tests, what papers, what activities do I want them to do? And then sort of working your way back, what do students need to be able to do that work? So I've really just always taken that kind of approach to thinking about teaching. So again, I think with a lot of these core elements, there's stuff that people do already. It's kind of already normal what our practice is. And I just find that really useful for giving me that framing for sort of understanding what am I doing today? What am I going to do in this course? What am I trying to achieve? What are we going to talk about? Right? And all the vast set of information. What am I trying to get to? What's the point here? So I've done this at the course level. I've done this even at the potentially even get down to the lecture level, right? What am I doing today in this class session? What are we going to like? What's the point? What are we going to try to get out of this session? And really starting with that question helps to ground and frame what we're trying to do. I've done this at program level stuff as well, right? I'm developing a new course. How is this course going to fit into the goals of the program, right? Into our overall degree. I'm chaired by program, so I need to sort of think about these kinds of things and then say, if the goal of our program is to meet this piece, where does this class fit in? Where is a potential gap that we might be trying to fit together? So it's really a way of framing what I'm doing already.
Thanks, Joel. Kristen, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I would say the same. But let me expand on it a little bit. For me, I teach a lot of asynchronous online classes right now. I have taught in person as well. And one thing that I have done is say those pieces out loud or write them in the materials. So just like Joel was talking about, to the assignment level, to the day level, to the the moment of the pieces, I will, have it in the course learning goals. I'll have it in the week's learning goals that'll be more specific to that week, and then the day. But as I'm talking about something, or as I'm writing something, or as we're going through a particular step in a module, I will be reiterating the piece. So there's a lot of communication that goes around reinforcing that piece, which I think is really useful for students, especially when they're saying, this is really busy work, or this doesn't make any sense, or why did I do this? My hope, I mean, you're never going to stop that entirely, but my hope is that by making that much more explicit, students will get like, oh, this is why I'm doing it. And the other thing is that it keeps me from putting in things that don't really fit. And so I might be really excited about, bringing in X material, or I just heard about this really cool assignment. But if it doesn't line up, if it's not lined up with the course learning goals, it doesn't match an outcome, then it helps me stay on track. And so helps me stay on track, helps students stay on track. So yeah, I use the same backward course design, just expanding upon that idea.
I want to note here two things that I heard that maybe we can explain in a little more detail. And Joel and Kristen and I talked about the questions I was going to ask, and this was not one of them. So here we go, off script already. This will be exciting. One of the things both of you mentioned is you figure out the why of what you're talking about, right? Or the what and then the why. And the what are those learning outcomes, right? And it's kind of it's not brain surgery to kind of say that, right? Like you got to know what and why you want to say something, but it's interesting how often we're not taught to teach like that. Right. And I remember, when I was coming up as a professor, a historian, like the place I started was, oh, I have to get from this date to this date. And that was it. That was the only what and why I was thinking about, which is a very good way to organize a course, actually. So having those learning outcomes, it sounds like, helps you organize. Kristen, you said also edit, right? Choose what you're going to talk about. But you also both talked about how it's important to articulate that to students. And can you say a little more about that? Like, what's been your experience in doing that or not doing that with students? Joel, do you remember when you started articulating to students?
Yeah. So I include my learning outcomes and all, in my syllabus on my Canvas page, right? This is the goals of the overall of the course. When I'm doing really well, and I want to be clear, I don't always succeed at achieving right things. I'm not perfect. When I'm doing really well, I'll even do things like, what's our goals for the day? What is the things we're trying to get out of a particular session or a particular activity? And even if I'm not necessarily saying those up front, right? Here's it's like, we're going to do this activity because you will learn these three things. These are the skills you're going to practice, right? Because that's the outcome. Often we'll want to, even when we're wrapping up an activity, if we're debriefing some activity that we've done in class, right? What students will often want is sort of what's the takeaway, right? We just spent 20 minutes working through, doing a think, pair, share. We spent 20 minutes working through a problem. What am I supposed to get out of all that? And this is the summary step almost. This is the things for you to take away. These are the objectives I want you to do. And so often, even just framing that, this is the key salient points. This is the stuff you need to know at a very operational level. This is the stuff that'll be on the exam. That's the outcome, right? And even for students saying, this is the things I need to know. It's a way of almost focusing what their attention needs to be, because I think one of the challenges students often have is trying to figure out how to navigate all the knowledge that is available and all the different things they need to understand and all the different pieces related to any particular aspect of what they're doing in a class, what they're doing in discipline, what they're doing in the field. And really, we're trying to help them synthesize that or select pieces from that to understand what they're working with. And I think having the sort of being clear on, this is what's the important part, this is the goal, this is what I want you to be able to do. Those other things are also relevant and interesting and important, but maybe that's not the goal right now. I don't need you to be able to do this. You can not worry about that. Don't stress about it. I think it helps sort of, again, guide what they're doing in the vast scope that is, knowledge at the university.
Yeah, I really appreciate your example there with the history piece and being told, you are to teach this period to this period. And I think, I don't think, I think one of you said the what, but I also would say the why. So one of the things that we are doing as instructors is thinking about, well, why do students need this? And then you can jettison pieces of it right out. But also sometimes you have the constraints of a university that say you need to teach this piece. And so to really grapple with that, like, well, why would that be important? Why would this, time period be important versus a different time period? Why do we have to end here? And I think that part of getting a course aligned is identifying and articulating and sharing that with students so that they go, oh, this is why, this is why I have why I need to look at this period. And if the instructor is buying in, I mean, that's what it expresses, right? That you've bought in and then you're showing them how they can buy in. And not that buy-in might not be the most appropriate word for teaching. There's probably a better one, but the idea is, are we all on the same page? Are we doing the same thing? Are we working toward the same goals? And so that, again, I mean, I come out of a field of communication, and so I think of always like, just talk, tell it, say it, write it. But I mean it in that sense, and that I think it's helpful to articulate that. And what Joel said, in terms of, the piece at the end. Well, what are we taking away with that? I mean, that's a piece of that, right? Here's what we're coming into the class with, and you do it, and then here's what we're walking away with the class. And I think that gives students a grounding that is really important in education.
So learning outcomes really are the kind of foundation of the alignment process or the backward design process. Rather than starting with, I got to cover all this content, you really start with thinking intentionally about your learning outcomes. And the payoff for doing that, from what I'm hearing from everybody, is that it helps you as an instructor remember why you're doing what you're doing, because it's easy to kind of forget, right? You're on kind of autopilot with your content. It helps students understand the importance of why you're making them jump through all these hoops, right? There is actually value to that. And something Joel said made me remember that, learning outcomes helps students filter and like listen and act strategically, right? And I think many of us have had students come into our office and they've performed really badly, say on a midterm or an assignment. And they're like, look, I took all these notes, and they're like verbatim notes, right? And they're just concentrating on the wrong things, right? Or they're trying to concentrate evenly on everything. And that's a losing proposition. So understanding the learning outcomes, I think, is good for instructors and students. I had a follow-up teed up, and I think we might have addressed it, but I'll ask it again. How did the process of aligning your course benefit you personally?
So yeah, I think what for me, my answer to this was also a lot of what Kristen sort of already mentioned, which is it helps provide that editing step and that filtering step to say, what is the things I actually need to be covering in this class, right? If I as Penn's example, if you're covering this era of history, well, what are the actual, like, what's the important parts? What are the things I actually need to get out of it? The thing that jumped into mind when we were sort of talking about this initially is, so I teach computer programming classes. That's the space that I'm working in the information school, which means that my field is under deep threat from AI right now. I mean, with many other fields, but mine in particular, because that's where tech people live. And so a lot of what I've been doing literally this year in this quarter is trying to think through, okay, what are the outcomes? What do I actually want students to get out of my class? And how is this then going to relate to the AI threat, right? Where is that fitting into? How does that change what the outcome should be? How does that change? How do I define this is what I want you to learn and this is what you need to understand, because this is what the AI systems don't do. And so it's really been helping me to actually to address that existential threat to teaching and to like my discipline, to think through what are the outcomes, like what's the goal here. So in many ways, going back to that backwards design, going back to, okay, giving me that thing to say, okay, what's the outcome? What am I trying to achieve? What's the purpose of why am I doing this thing that I'm doing? Has helped a lot in only just like letting me be able to think like, okay, I think I'm actually all right. Some of the stuff that is, that now feels like it's old is actually still valuable, right? There's reasons that we're doing this, and there were reasons that I started doing them years ago, and those things are still there. So it's actually helped me to, in some ways, it's a comforting step to be able to realign that kind of piece.
Yeah, I would say um, backward design as a process is something that's fairly intuitive for me, and something that I also have been trained with from early on in my teaching. So that's not as new for me. What's newer for me is getting so in the past I've tried to have an assignment meet many learning goals. Like I have a bunch of things kind of squeezed into one. And I have gotten much more streamlined about that. Um, for me personally, I'm a very organized, structured person. And so for me to have a class that's organized and structured is just I like it more. I find it easier to be spontaneous, and easier to be responsive, and easier to have these really unpredictable things that happen with students in particular, but sometimes to the university happen. I feel much calmer because I've got a lot of structure in place, and those pieces are a lot more predictable. And I think for our students, at least, this last summer, I polled students. I've done this different quarters as well, but I asked students, what is it that that would help me understand about your learning, to help you with your learning. And student after student was talked about how they wanted something that was more predictable, wanted something that they could count on, not being surprised. And I mean, I think as a whole, backward design helps us do that, but also having assignments on the same day, a particular kind of assignment due on the same day, or a particular kind of um, discussion happening on the same day. That there's a predictability to the course, that you can express to students, so that when they log in or they show up in a classroom, that they're like, oh, this is how this is going to go. And that may at times feel really boring. I have definitely gotten that feedback, and I get it. But it also is calming for some of the students, because there's this structure that then when something chaotic happens in the world around us, which happens all the time, we have something we can lean back and into. So I think alignment helps us with that, because there's like a backbone to the course, to the quarter, to the day.
Thank you for those responses. I'm trying to think of how I would answer this question, and I do remember, um, when I kind of was liberated from thinking about coverage of tons of content, and instead pivoted toward thinking about what is it that I want my students to be able to do and kind of think about as a result of engaging with me. It kind of unyoked me from convention, right? So like history courses were like pretty famous for, okay, it's the 25-page research paper at the end of the semester. And as class sizes tick up, I'm like, well, I'm killing myself. And I felt guilty. Really, like, am I changing this assignment just because the class is getting bigger? But actually, when I started thinking about alignment, like, wait, how does a 25-page research paper benefit these students? Like, what am I trying to do with this? And just asking those questions, I found pretty liberating. And it was a question, the answer to that question changed depending on my students. Like when I taught graduate students, yeah, a 25-page research paper at a minimum was pretty important, but maybe not for undergrads. So yeah, it helped me ask key questions about what was I doing with these research papers, these huge research papers. Cool. One of the things that Joel and I worked on the Future of Teaching and Learning initiative together, and we went around all of the campuses and talked to lots of people. And one of the questions that we heard from faculty when the faculty were considering whether or not to adopt these new elements into the code was a little bit of trepidation that they would not know how to demonstrate these in, say, a promotion and tenure situation or an annual evaluation situation. So if we're ready, I think I want to pivot to talking about how would you demonstrate that you have integrated the element of alignment into your teaching? How would you demonstrate that in an annual evaluation or in a promotion and tenure situation? And I don't care who goes first. Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in, and I appreciate the opportunity to think about this in advance. It is something that I have demonstrated actually when I was applying to, this is years ago when we had the more permanent lecture position. And I really had to think through, like, what am I doing? What are the outcomes? And at that time, I created a slide, so it's in my teaching talk, right? So I was showing people, this is what I'm going to do in this process. And that is how I would do it. I would create some kind of visual and narrative that gives examples of how am I doing this? How is it aligned? And so, for example, I'm teaching an introduction to journalism class that I have. By the way, at some point I might like to talk a little bit about team teaching, but I co-developed this class with someone else, and so we worked through the learning goals together. We talked through our different styles, and really thought through, like, why are we created this class from scratch. So what do we want the students to come out with? What are we going to do in terms of assessing that? And then what are the assignments and the learning activities that we are going to have? So I would create, I'm going to do this backward because of how it shows up on the screen. But here's the starting. I'm sorry, I would start here. Here are the learning goals and outcomes. And so how do we feed into that? So for me, in this class, one of my learning goals and outcomes is to identify and practice news, storytelling, and strategies across mediums. So how do I find that? Like, how do I make sure that there's an assessment of that? So I might include my syllabus to show my learning goals, right? And then for assessment, how do you know? Like, how do you know that students are able to identify and practice this, right? So I'm looking for evidence of identifying, and I'm also looking for evidence of practicing, right? So I'm looking for these examples of that in work. So how do I get there? So then I go back a step further and I think about learning activities. So what instructional materials do the students need to help them show evidence of identifying? How do I help find materials that help them practice, or how do I create assignments that help them practice? So for me, that links to what I call weekly storytelling activities. I have course materials and videos or discussions or materials that help them think that through. And then it's designed to help students identify and practice new storytelling strategies across mediums. And so I would do something that links those three, where you don't start at the learning activity, right? But I would show how that supports the assessment, supports the learning goals and outcomes. Something that shows movement, directionality. And I personally think that some kind of visual helps in materials that would demonstrate that. But I also, because I like the narrative, would also explain. And then I would show some examples, like, here's a student work, or here's from my materials, here's how that lines up. So that's how I would do that. I would try to help. I would try to do the conceptualization work on my own and explain it in those two different ways.
I know, did you want to share your slide or?
Well, I can show the slide. It's not super fancy, but I'll share it. I shared it right before we got here. And so the worry I have is, am I going to make a big screen and then lose you all? But let's see if I can try that.
We can see it, right? Yeah, we can see
Okay.
it. Yeah, great.
Yeah. So that's how I do it, right? Is I would show something with arrows, super simple, and then I'd point to different places. And as I created this, I went into my course, and I made sure this lined up, right? So I looked for, okay, what are my learning goals? And I'm like, I'll just pick the first one, right? And then I went and tried to say, well, how would I, and I've done this work before, so it didn't surprise me that it was relatively easy because, again, I've just created this course recently, co-developed it with someone, back and forth this conversation. This is with Dr. Mintang. And, we're talking about how do we do this? And, just to add a layer to this, Dr. Tang, when she teaches this class, will be teaching it either hybrid or all in person. And I'm teaching it asynchronous online, right? So I'm trying to think through, how do we do this in different uh, ways of delivering this. And so that's another layer of that. And the fact that we have these learning goals helped us think that through. So in this case, it's not as hard, but there was another one where there was a piece of discussion. And so what does that look like in a classroom? What does it look like elsewhere? Are we doing similar, does the learning activity still support the assessment? Does the assessment still support the learning goals? So let me see if I can unshare. There we go.
I love
Hopefully.
that. I love what that demonstrated, because like what that shows is like you're very thoughtful about how the activity works toward the outcome. Like, I can imagine I've encountered some professors where no matter what the outcome is, midterm is the activity, right? So, like a multiple choice midterm is probably not an activity that aligns really well with the storytelling outcome. So your slide really shows the relationship and the thoughtfulness that you engaged in lining up the activity with the learning outcome. Joel, what about you?
Yeah, so I think for promotion and merit stuff, I think that's exactly what the benefit is, and that's how what I did in my packet is trying to be able to say, here is how I'm using this idea of backwards alignment. Here I'm using this aligned process to indicate this is how I'm thinking through my courses, right? I'm not just that is my teaching philosophy, right? That is how I'm thinking through these processes. That means I'm actually doing that kind of consideration. I'm not just being like, here's the thing I teach and I do this and that's great. Or I do this and students give me good numbers. And like, that's not what's going on here. It's very much about how am I thinking about this process? Why did I choose to do this kind of thing in my course? Why am I using these activities? What's the benefit? What's the purpose of doing these pedagogical approaches? Why did I structure it this way? Because what is the outcome? How is that trying to support what I'm doing? I also use this actually in my packet to also talk about like growth areas. So like there's one of my classes that didn't go very well when I first taught it, and and this is one of the things I had to respond to in my packet, and that's kind of where I'd use for it. I'd say, okay, here's what didn't go well, and that's because the goals were too broad. In many ways I was trying to do too much in the first time I taught this course, and it didn't work very well, and also in the second time I taught the course, and the third time I finally fixed it. But it's being able to say, here's what the challenge was, right? This is where things were aligned, and the way that I fixed it was by scoping down that alignment, scoping down what were the outcomes, what was I actually trying to achieve, and then being able to write through how I've managed to adjust that. And so I'm actually using it to show that kind of growth and show that kind of development, which is one of those things that works out really, comes across pretty well in a packet. Because again, that's what we're looking for often is how are people growing as instructors, right? How are they developing, right? No one's perfect. We're not all ending perfect. It's how are you improving as you go?
Can I add one more thing to that?
Absolutely.
Something that I have done with this class specifically, and I would do it with others. I don't do it with every class, but um, I have a quiz right at the end of the quarter, and it's really a reflection quiz. And what I have done recently is have 4 different questions. Each one is lined up with a learning goal. And I say, this course had 4 learning outcomes. Everything, and I mean everything, this is my words, this is kind of how I talk, everything, and I mean everything was designed with these in mind. Here is one of the 4. Take time to write a paragraph or so about what helped you the most in meeting this course outcome. And so the first one would be identify and practice new storytelling strategies across medium. So I'm asking them to think back on whatever I had, and I make the assumption that something there fit, right? So it's not a unbiased question, right? But I'm asking them to think back on all the different things that we did. What helped you toward this learning goal? And it's so nice as an instructor to see the alignment, right? To see, and so I would put that in as evidence as well, is that students are reflecting on it in these particular ways. I don't think that's as strong as the images and how showing the evidence from the class, but it because I do think maybe the outcome of an assignment is a little stronger than this reflection, but I think the reflection is important, and it shows that students are seeing the alignment. So
Last thing I'll kind of add one more piece in is that I'll notice that, and Penn, I think you mentioned this earlier, is that students Kristen, came up earlier that students they're really interested in that structure and that organization and that transparency on how things are organized. And those are actually often comments that'll show up in the student evaluations of teaching, right? Is students will be like, this course was really well organized. I appreciated that I knew when things were and how deadlines. Or for when courses don't go as well, and you'll see this where students will be like, I didn't understand how this course was organized. It felt disorganized. It felt like things weren't, I didn't understand why we were doing things. This felt like it was extraneous. And so I think being able to then take that kind of evidence, right, that you're getting from students about the student's perception of your teaching, I won't say quality of teaching, the perception of your teaching, and being able to then use that, say, oh, this is like how this is the things that students are responding positively towards are these alignment processes. And I think that I've seen the alignment and positive responsive alignment being well aligned. So those things are connected.
Your use of the word organized reminded me of the old language in the faculty code, which to the Future of Teaching and Learning group did some historical digging, and to the best of our knowledge, we determined that the faculty code language on effective teaching hadn't been updated in about 50 years, which, yeah, cringe. But one of the old elements or whatever was like, your course will be organized. So alignment is just a kind of more nuanced organizational scheme, right? And so it's really an update to that faculty
Yeah.
code. But yeah, good. Thank you both for talking about how you might demonstrate that in a promotion and tenure process. And what came through for me was just like taking the time to annotate stuff, right? And maybe annotate that visual. Kristen, I can imagine you throwing some quotations from students on that same slide, like, yeah, this activity worked for me, and I understood that it was connected to the learning outcome. So that's
Yes,
cool.
definitely.
We are almost at time. I just want to thank Kristen and Joel and our captioner for being with us today. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.